well, we have a slightly unusual occurrence this morning in that you see on your programme we have Emily Reed Burdett and Michael Burdett. And when I invited them independently to speak, I did not realise that they are actually married to one another. So I kind of deduced it afterwards, and it's unusual, but it's a great pleasure. We get we don't get two for the price of one, but we are paying both of them independently, and they are here in their own academic right. Emily Reed Burdett is a psychologist. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of St Andrews, working on a comparative psychology project looking at the origins and development of social learning. Her PhD from the University of Oxford was looking at children's conceptions of supernatural beings such as God, and that's part of what she's going to talk about, I think, this morning. So Emily, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to talk about the work that I do in my PhD. Hopefully you all at least know, if you don't have kids already, then you know at least some kids that you can identify with when I talk about this. So what I want to do first is talk to you a little bit about some of the cognitive aspects of how our mind works, and weave that in with some developmental literature. So you can get a feel for basically what the title is, the science of children's belief, so how we actually test how children start to believe and start to think about religious and supernatural ideas. And then hopefully if I have time, I'll get to share with you some of the work that I did for my PhD. So that's the structure of what I'm going to do. And I'll start off with a quote by Richard Dawkins, and I'll just read this to you. If there are opinions about the cosmos and the world that children, once grown, will presumably be in a position to evaluate for themselves, religion is the one field in our culture about which it is absolutely accepted without question, without even noticing how bizarre it is that parents have a total and absolute say in what their children are going to be, how their children are going to be raised, what opinions their children are going to have about the cosmos, about life, about existence. Do you see what I mean about mental child abuse? And then again, children blindly accept from authorities propositions about the world, about the cosmos, about morality, about human nature. And what I want to share with you is a lot of the science that has been shown that regardless of what kids learn, they have these natural tendencies to believe in the supernatural. So yes, there's some aspect to what parents share with them to get basically the cultural concept of it, but children they come up with all sorts of supernatural ideas. So it's a very natural part of their development. So Richard Dawkins in this respect is wrong.
Not only usual.
So this is a slide I got from Justin Barrett, but so Richard Dawkins would say that children are indoctrinated to believe in religion. And what I want to suggest with the research that has been going on for the past 15 years, that this just isn't the case. What we're finding is kids aren't indoctrinated. They believe this stuff naturally. So I just want to start with Jean Piaget. He's the first developmental psychologist, and he looked at a variety of things. But one of the things he did look at was religion and how children develop these ideas. And what he thought was that it was quite late that children could actually have a concept of God and supernatural ideas, at least a theologically correct one. So he thought it was only until 7 years. And what our research shows, children actually quite young can have a concept of God. He also thought that God is naturally regarded as like a man, so he thought that children anthropomorphized God. So they have to think of him basically as like a super father or a superhuman. But the research that we show that kids actually have a more complex idea about who God is. They don't have to think about him as a superhuman. So how do we develop these religious ideas in development? And what does it mean to kind of have these concepts? So I want to share with you some of the various cognitive mechanisms. And what I mean here, we talk about basically cognitive domains. And these are non-physical parts of our brain. This is how we compartmentalize certain aspects of our cognition. So one of these, here's 4 that I'm going to be talking about. So one of them is theory of mind. One of them is called the hypersensitivity agency detection device. That's a mouthful. I'll explain what that means later. Minimal counterintuitive ideas and promiscuous teleology. So these are all different cognitive mechanisms that we all have in our cognition. They're very intuitive. We employ them all the time. And I'll show you what this means in a bit. So Justin Barrett, he's one of the forerunners in a field called the cognitive science of religion. So people in this field are taking parts of cognitive science, being able to use those tools to test how we come up and how these ideas originate. These are two books that he's recently written, Why Would Anyone Believe in God? And a more recent book called We're Believers. And in these books, he basically shares the past 15 years of research and also his own research. And he gives evidence to suggest that children have a remarkable tendency to believe in gods, as well as other types of supernatural agents and supernatural events. He specifically believes that children come into this world with the basic cognitive equipment to believe in gods. So he would say that children are born believers. They're born believing in supernatural ideas. Deb Kellerman, she's a researcher at the University of Boston, or Boston University. She has a different word for it. She calls them intuitive theists. And we'll share some of her work as well in a bit. So Piaget and a lot of other people thought that when babies are born in the world, they really know nothing. They're not coming to the world prepared to know anything. But actually, what we've been showing is that kids, even babies, come into the world with certain packages in the brain so that they can glean knowledge as quickly as they can. And we talk about basically 3 different domains in psychology. These are very intuitive for them. So one of them is physics. And there's these great experiments with babies where they look at, babies can actually understand gravity. They can understand when you have contact, so when something comes in contact with someone, it moves. They know that things just can't move on their own. They understand that people can move on their own, but objects can't move on their own. And what they do is, they've got things like, it almost looks like a magic experiment. So these babies are watching a movie, a ball suspends from the ceiling and stops midair. And what they measure is how long baby looks in this experiment. If they look longer, probably like what an adult would do, it's assumed that they're looking at it because they're shocked. Why is that ball just suspended in the middle of the air? And so this gives us an indication that it's unnatural. So babies are looking at it, trying to figure out, why in the world is this ball doing this? So we've got experiments and experimental evidence that shows that babies seem to have some kind of intuitive understanding about how the physical world works. There's the domain of psychology. So this is basically the domain that I'm going to be talking about. So very young children are developing ideas about humans. Humans are wildly complex, as you all know, especially as a psychologist, I know. It's very hard to understand the complexity of human nature. But kids have some intuitive understanding about how humans work. They know that we can animate ourselves, we can move around, we're not a puppet on a string, and these kind of things. And I'll share more about what this domain is like. Also about biology, kids, they quickly learn that cats have kittens, cats don't have slugs as babies. They quickly understand that we get bigger with age, we don't seem to get smaller, we get older, and these kinds of things. It's an intuitive understanding about how biology works. So here are some cognitive mechanisms. So this is the domain of psychology. So theory of mind, it's our ability to attribute mental states such as intentions, feelings, emotions, beliefs, knowledge, and desires. And this theory of mind really doesn't come on until you're about 3 years old. Between 3 and 4.5, they start to really develop this. So it's really fun when you talk to a child that's younger than 4 who's starting to develop this. They really don't understand that what they're thinking, that you honestly think something differently. So if you ask them what their favorite thing is for dinner, pizza, and you don't like pizza, they have a really hard time understanding why in the world wouldn't you like pizza? Because they themselves like pizza. Or something that they just learned, basically how to tie their shoes. They've encountered someone else that doesn't know how to tie their shoes. They have a hard time understanding why in the world that person wouldn't know how to tie their shoe as well. So how we test this in psychology, it's called a false belief task. And we basically give them something familiar to them. So in this case, these are American children, some Ritz crackers. And we show them the cracker box, and we say, what do you think is inside this box? And then they say, well, there's crackers inside. And then you open it up and you put actually something surprising inside. So let's say some socks. or I'll obviously rocks, just for the slide that I have here. There's rocks inside the box. You close it up and say, okay, what's inside the box? There's rocks inside the box. Okay, so then you say, okay, your mom walked in here for the very first time. What do you think your mom would say is inside the box? And a 3-year-old who doesn't have theory of mind, who thinks that whatever they know, everyone else knows, says, Mom knows it's rocks inside the box. But a 5-year-old who's now developed theory of mind realizes, well, Mom didn't see you show me that there's actually rocks inside the box. She'd probably think there's crackers inside the box. So kids who pass this test, or don't pass this test, would say that there's rocks inside the box. Kids who pass it, they say that there's crackers inside the box. And I want to show you what this looks like. I have a video that I got from YouTube about, there's a gentleman giving this false belief task to a little girl. And they're using a crayon box. And she's 3, so you can see what kind of response that she gives him for this test. Can everyone hear it?
Just hold your microphone there.
Okay. What's really inside the box? Evidence? Before I opened it, what did you think was inside the box? That's right. I'm going to close the box now. Now Jenna is outside. If Jenna comes back in the room, what will she say is inside the box?
So she said M&Ms. M&Ms were actually inside the crayon box.
Smarties.
Yeah, the little chocolate candy. So she's a 3-year-old. She obviously didn't pass the theory of mind test yet. So she's not at that age where she can hold that someone else can have a false belief about something. And we'll return to this later. There's some experiments using this to ask children what they think God would know is inside the box, but we'll get back to it. There's another cognitive mechanism called the minimal counterintuitive theory. We in the field call it MCI theory. And this is just the idea that anything that goes counter to our natural expectation about how the world works is interesting to us. So something that's minimally counterintuitive is something like a ghost. So a ghost is basically a person, but a person that can walk through walls. So that's just something that's been tweaked about their naturalness, their natural part of the world, and it's been tweaked, their physical ability. And we find this interesting. So another one would be like a fairy or an elf, or lots of things that you find widely in movies and in literature and in children's stories. For some reason, as the theory goes, these ideas are way more interesting to us. It's way more interesting to talk about. A toaster that winks, that is talking to you, it's way more interesting to talk about an elf, so someone that can live, who's immortal, or a ghost. We much more probably like to talk about over dinner than just a normal person. So that's why these ideas seem to be so prevalent in society. We seem to talk about them a lot, therefore they're transmitted. And that's why a lot of these ideas, we think, have persisted for so long, because they're interesting, they're fascinating. So here's this mouthful. It's the hypersensitivity agency detection device. And before I explain this to you, I have another clip. This was an experiment done in the 40s by Hyder and Simmel. And they were testing something completely different. But what I want you to do is watch this clip, and I want you to tell me, after the clip is done, I'm going to ask for a volunteer, tell me what you saw. Yeah, there's no sound in this one. tell me what was going on in the video. Or someone can just shout out what they thought, interpret what they saw.
A big bully living in the house, and a couple come along and goes out and has a row with the bloke, and the girl comes in, and she gets her fella comes and gets her out, and then they have a little kiss and off they go.
That was great, thank you. So basically, what they were testing is actually just kind of movement, but they got a lot of these responses. People started to attribute agency to these shapes. So objects don't normally do this kind of thing, but people all of a sudden were just interpreting more kind of human-like qualities to these. And we do it so naturally. Obviously, I think you all interpreted some version of maybe a little bit of that story to these objects. But we do it with also shapes. So in this case, a lot of people would say they'd see 2 eyes and a nose, whereas in this case we don't. But people do it with all sorts of stuff. We attribute human-like qualities. And this is something that we do it. So it's called the hypersensitive agency detection device, because we do this without even thinking. We do it in a split second. We attribute agency where there's really none. Yeah. So another aspect, this is Deb Callman's work, who I mentioned previously at Boston University, and I love this term that she uses. She calls kids, and also adults, promiscuous teleologists. And this is the idea that we attribute, basically, function, we attribute design in the world, where really, may or may not be the case. And what she's done is she's done a bunch of studies asking kids a few questions. So here's a few. So why do you think rocks are so pointy? And the kids say they were pointy so the animals wouldn't sit on them and smash them. They were pointy because bits of stuff piled up on top of one another for a long time. So instead of giving probably a more scientific answer, why it's pointy because of some erosion or whatever the case may be, they attribute some purpose to these things. Here's some more. Why did the first ever bird exist? To make nice music, because it made the world look nice. Why did the first monkey exist? So that when we had somebody to climb trees, so there could be an animal in the jungle. Why did the first mountain exist? They made mountains so people could look at them. Hey, that's interesting. Why did the first river exist? So boats could come in the water so that people could do fishing. So again, they're attributing purpose all the time. And really, these responses are cute. Why they think these things have come about.
Why do you call it promiscuous?
She called it promiscuous because we do it seemingly so natural. So if you ask kids something about, promiscuous means we do it all the time. But it's a good word tonight. It gets your attention, doesn't it? The interesting thing is adults do this as well. So when you give the same type of questions, why did the first monkey exist? Why did rivers exist? And you give them basically a few different responses, and you do it under time pressure. Adults do it, biologists do it, so people that are specialized to know that actually there's a scientific reason will still give these purposeful answers under time conditions. So it seems to be something that's very intuitive to us. It's hard to shake. It's hard for us not to think that things don't have a purpose. So this is one of these other cognitive mechanisms that just seems to be rattling around in our brain that we have to take control of. So another person, Olivera Petrovich, who was a developmental psychologist at Oxford, she took a lot of these questions and went a step further. She was wondering, so kids are these promiscuous teleologists and they're attributing purpose. So that one child said they created mountains. So she wanted to know, who are these people or beings that these kids are talking about? So she asked them, so we've been talking about mountains, rivers, monkeys, birds, so the same questions before. Now here's the next question. Did someone or something make the first ever mountain exist, or did it just happen? So under half the children said someone made natural events, so things like thunder. She's asking more about those kind of events. So just a little under half said that someone made those. Over half said someone made natural objects, so rocks and mountains and things like that. And 73% said someone made animals.
So what age was this, did you say?
So these kids are, I think it was between 4 and 7. And then she asked, well, who made artifacts, natural objects, and animals? So who were these, who is this someone that kids were referring to? And she gave them a few choices. So she said, was it people? Was it God? Or does no one know? So she was trying to give them different responses, and she counterbalanced this to make sure that kids would have an equal chance of responding about any of these. And children were 7 times more likely to say that God made the natural objects. And these are kids from a variety of different backgrounds. It was very intuitive for them to think that a higher being, so God in this case, made these objects and animals. So another person named Margaret Evans, who's at the University of Michigan, she took this research and said, well then, how do kids actually conceptualize evolution? And if they've got these natural tendencies to apply purpose in the world, and they think that someone has created a lot of these things, how are they thinking about evolution? So she asked children about the origins of the sun bear, which is on the left, the tuatara, which is a lizard, and the human being. And she was asking things about basically animals and objects that kids probably normally wouldn't have heard of. She wanted to kind of cue in some things that these are novel objects. They wouldn't have some understanding about where they came from. And kids, so what she wanted to do was basically ask children in homes that weren't religious and children in homes that were religious to see what kind of cultural background and exposure both these types of kids had been exposed to. And then she was asking this question, how are they thinking about the origins of these ideas? And interestingly, kids, regardless of where they were from, whether they were from an atheist home or from a religious home, they offered more creationist accounts. So they believed that someone had created these human beings and animals. And they did it more than just a spontaneous account. So what she was coding was for kids that just said, oh, they just came into the world. And also an evolutionary account. So even though parents were teaching kids about evolution, they didn't ever seem to talk about evolutionary accounts. So she asked, these are kids from 6 to 11. You didn't start to see them talking about evolutionary accounts until they were about 10 years old. And this is not to say that creationism is right. It's just saying that because of all these mechanisms I've been talking about, it's really hard even for adults to think about the concept of evolution because we've got this natural tendency to think about purpose in the world and a designer, which is often why I think as adults we have misconstrued about how evolution works. It's a very complicated process. It goes counter to what these mechanisms that we have, so it takes a lot of practice to understand actually how it works. It's very complex. And so we see this with development for kids. It's very hard for them to understand that there's not more purpose in the world. So what Margaret Evans is doing now, she's created this museum to kind of talk about, in a developmental way, with very young kids, how evolution works. Especially with micro and macro evolution is what she's looking at. Kids have a hard time understanding how that process works. So she's developed this little museum that kids can go through, and she's looking at how that improves their understanding. So I've been talking about how kids find it natural to believe in a lot of supernatural things, but are they just gullible? Will they believe in anything? No, they will not believe in just anything. There's a guy named Paul Harris. He's at Harvard University. He used to be at the University of Oxford for a very long time. He's very interested in children's understanding of the supernatural. And so he was interested in this idea, well, if kids find all these supernatural ideas so intuitive and they talk about it, how gullible are they actually? And so he asked 5 and 6-year-olds about different types of entities that you can't see. So he talked about non-endorsed entities, so mermaids and ghosts, so things that people don't actually say, I believe in a mermaid, or I believe in a ghost. But we do talk about these kind of things in children's stories and that kind of thing. Then he talked about endorsed identities, so things that actually are in our cultural everyday life. So of course God, the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, so things that they would probably say that you believe in Santa Claus. And then also scientific entities, so germs and oxygen. We can't see those, but he was interested to see, well, do kids believe in those as well, because they can't see them. And what he found is these 5 and 6-year-olds, so very young. They don't believe in mermaids, but they do believe in God insurance, that they exist. So they're not gullible. They know. This is one of my favorite studies, and this will show you kind of how much children are prepared to think about the supernatural. This is a study done by Jesse Baring, who was at the University of Belfast. He is now at the University, I think, of Otago, New Zealand, doing a lot of public engagement type of stuff. He did a lot of studies on how children understand the supernatural. And this is one of my favorite studies called Princess Alice Study, and he basically had 3 groups of children. One, so he told them, they'd come into a room and there was a target on the wall, and he said, okay, I want you get a prize for how many balls, these are Velcro balls, you can get on that target. But I'm going to leave the room, and you can do whatever you like. But the thing is, you have to, instead of facing forward, you have to face, your back has to be, then you have to throw it with your non-dominant hands. If they're right-handed, they have to throw it with your left. And basically do it that way. And so there were 3 groups of children. So he left the room, and one group of children were left alone. And another group, children were left, there was another experimenter sitting in a chair. And then in another experiment, he told her, now Princess Alice, she used to be in this room, but she's dead now, but she still likes to sit in this chair. So I'm going to leave, but Princess Alice, she might still be in this room. So he was interested to see how much of their cheating behavior would happen when he left that room. So I'll show you a video, a clip of this little boy, and then you can see what happens. So this is, he's in the condition with Princess Alice. So there's the chair. So now he's waiting for Jesse Baring to come back to the room. So basically what happened here, you saw him kind of testing out, is Princess Alice really here? So he sits on her, and then realizes she's not real, and then he cheats. So basically what they showed was, so the kids that were left in the room by themselves, they all cheated. And then a very few were honest. And then in the case of the experimenter in the room, none of them cheated. And in this case, you find that kids actually started, thinking, well, if Princess Alice in the room, I don't want to cheat. Their cheating behavior wasn't very strong because they were convinced that Princess Alice was in the room. So here are some other topics. I don't have time to go through all of the type of studies that people have been doing in developmental psychology, but they've also been looking at rituals, so ritual type of behavior, magic, their belief in magic, how that works, the transmission of religious ideas, how these ideas spread, what we find interesting, prayer, reincarnation, souls, minds, and bodies, and spirit possession. So there's a lot of rich studies out there if you're interested. So conclusion, so what does this say about how children develop these ideas? It's just that our minds have the incredible capacity to learn about the world because of these cognitive mechanisms. So these cognitive mechanisms are in place so we learn about the natural world. A byproduct of it, though, is that we also come to think about supernatural ideas so very easily. And then these certain cognitive mechanisms that I showed you may bias to entertain ideas about supernatural agents. So here's a little bit about my work. These are some of the people that I had the privilege of working with in the University of Oxford. So the guy on the top left is Dr. Garrett, who is my PhD supervisor. So he was the one I worked most closely with. So the broad focus of my work is I was interested in how these ideas transmit. So why is God so prevalent in the top world religions and across the world? What is it about him that these ideas originated and why we find him so interesting? And then also, in cognitive development, how do we understand the limitations of humans and animals, but then we apply so many superhuman or supernatural qualities to other beings? And how do kids kind of really understand the difference between what God is and what God can do compared to us? So a lot of kids at 3, they think that mom and dad can lift the refrigerator, that they know everything. When do they start to figure out that mom and dad don't really know everything, but God does? So these are the research questions I was motivated by. So how do children conceptualize and evaluate the variety of minds they come in contact with? So the tooth fairy to God, to their auntie, to their dog. How do they figure out what the different abilities for all these beings are? And I'm really interested in cross-cultural research. So I've done a lot of cross-cultural work in Israel, Albania, and just recently China. So I'm interested in how also different cultures kind of influence how children think about these things. So I'll share with you, it looks like I have time for maybe just one study. So do children understand the human or non-human limitations of knowledge acquisition? So this is basically, I'm going to show you what it looks like with a theory of mind test, what that looks like when you ask children about God. And then if we have time, we'll look at memory. So I'll be sharing with you two different samples. So one in Britain with children, and then also one in Israel. So the one in Britain was with Christian children, and the one in Israel was with Jewish children. And here I was just trying to look at, so because Christian and Jewish traditions, we basically have very similar concepts of who God is. But also in the Jewish tradition, we don't seem to have the anthropomorphic factor because there's not a Jesus character in the mix. And so I was interested to see how children develop these concepts of God in their separate traditions and also in two separate countries. So we're going to be looking at ignorant versus all-knowing minds first. So this came out of a study. So Justin Barrett, he did this study in 2003, and he gave children that cracker box and showed children that there was rocks inside. And then he asked them about several different agents if they came into the room for the first time. He told them about mother, a bear, an elephant, a snake, and a tree, and then also God. And this is what he found. So this is age, and this is how much they've attributed ignorance or knowledge. And so with God, which is this yellow one, across all age groups, they've attributed God with knowing that there was rocks inside the box. But with all the other agents, you see this huge gap between 4 and 5. So at the age where they're acquiring theory of mind, that's where they finally discovered that their mother, a bear, elephant, snake, and tree, would not know what was inside the box. They would think that there is rocks inside the box from 3 and 4, and then at 5, they realized, oh, they'd probably be fooled to think there's crackers inside the box. So that's the developmental trend of what he found. But Justin Barrett got a lot of criticism because children at 3 years of age have a yes bias. So they a lot of times when you ask them questions, they'll just say yes to everything. So it wasn't very clear in the literature whether children were just having a yes bias here. So they said yes to all these agents, that they know that there's rocks inside the box, or that they're actually just attributing knowledge to this task. So what I did is give them a task where they don't know what's inside the box. So they don't have the ability to understand, well, if I think there's rocks inside the box, everyone else does. So in this case, children were ignorant. So we gave them an unknown box and said, okay, there's something inside this box. I'm not telling you what it is. Kind of shook it so they know that there's something that's actually inside. And then asked the same question. So if mom walked in for the first time, but mom knows what's inside the box, etc. And then we asked about God and a few other agents. We also asked them about Sweck and Bach. These are made-up fictional characters to try and see if we give them a novel supernatural agent. So Sweck is our supernatural agent. We said Sweck is someone who knows everything. He can see through things. And Bach, he's just a person like you and me. He doesn't know everything. Just to kind of see if kids, when they're actually given the concept for the very first time, whether their cognitive mechanisms can take that and apply to this type of task. So here's the box that I used. So again, we'd ask them about mom or God, and a person just like you and me, that's Bach, and Sweck, a person who can see things and knows everything. And here's what we found. So the blue line is Israeli kids, and the red is the British kids. And there's no difference between cultural groups or religions. So kids across cultures said the same thing along the same lines. And here's the developmental trend. So very interestingly, at 3 years of age, so the top 2 lines are Sweck and God, and the bottom 2, the top 2 are Bach and Mom, and the bottom 2 are Sweck and God. So very early on, so they're distinguishing, which is really cool. They're actually saying, okay, I know which agents are limited. It's Bach and Mom. but I know that second God would probably know what's inside, and that just gets better with age. So there's still a chance at 3 years, but you really see that certain kids actually are distinguishing between these types of ages, which is really cool. It's a very young age. This is before theory of mind that they're getting this, and by 4, they're significantly distinguishing. So that's pretty early. So maybe these kids are a little bit younger than the natural kind of bigger sample of kids who get theory of mind at 5. But that's really cool. So at a very young age, kids are getting this. They understand the difference. Let's see what time I have. But this, I'm just going to briefly say, this is another text that I did about memory. We gave basically children a variety of agents. So you see a granddad puppet here, a baby, and a dog. And here I was just trying to figure out what kids thought about different types of agents. So a dog who's basically going to be stupid. And then granddad is, well, in the sense of memory. So they get a memory task, and they have to basically play the game until they forget and they can't remember where the card is. And then I'm interested to see, okay, so these different age agents, so granddad who's very old, and a baby who's very young, would they remember where the card is? Would a dog remember? Do you think God would remember where that card is and their mom? And I was interested to see between these different agents how they would attribute memory. So it's totally plausible a dog could remember, maybe by sight, but not likely. He probably doesn't know what's going on. And a baby might be too young to understand this type of task. Or as a granddad, who knows? The mom, who knows? But God would probably know where the card is. So they played this task. We gave them a little, this is a fishing game. So we turned over the cards. They played a little distraction task. And then that's when we said, do you remember where this card is? And then they played. So there was a little girl here playing a little distraction task over the cards that you can see there. And here's the agents that we used. We also included Sweck and Bop again. So Sweck this time was a person with good memory. Bop was someone with a terrible memory. And then it was God. And what we find is pretty cute. So 3-year-olds, they're attributing mom, which is the kind of turquoise line, Sweck, the orange line, and God, which is the purple line, with good memories. And they're a chance for everyone else. And then 4, 5, and adults, you start to see a bigger trend. So the purple line is Bop. They're pretty good at realizing, okay, you said Bop has a terrible memory. He probably would not remember where that card is. So they're pretty good at that. And Dog doesn't seem to figure out till they're 5 years old. And of course, the adults, that he probably wouldn't remember where that card was. And Baby and Granddad, they're really unsure. Even adults are kind of unsure about whether someone has a granddad know where the card is. But the cute thing is, even at 5-year-olds and 4-year-olds are still thinking their mom would know where the card is. And realistically, she could know it. Mom could be really smart. So I think that's pretty cute that kids are still attributing mom at this range. But overall, the thing that's most consistent across is that Sweck and God would know where that card was, and you're pretty good at that. So it's pretty cool. So you can kind of see this developmental trend with all these kids. And I think I'll end with just a quick video. This is with a little boy in Israel. And I realized he was my very last subject of Israel. And I realized I don't have a video of this. So he's the boy, he's going to say yes to everything. So he's only 3. He said they all would remember where the card was. So you'll get to see what he does.
Do you remember what he got?
So these are modern Orthodox Jewish families.
They speak English, they have
Well, it was a variety of kids. So I don't actually know the percentage. Some of the kids only spoke Hebrew, and so I had a research assistant that helped me with the Hebrew. But there were some families that also knew English, so they were dual bilingual. So this was a family that was bilingual. It doesn't seem to be working.
God is God.
Okay, I'll switch. Yes, that's pretty good.
Do you want to slide?
There we go. Yeah. I'm just, because I'm over time, this is currently, so if we could talk about questions if you wanted to. But just some other books, if you guys are interested. I realize I didn't put in my abstract some further reading, but if you're interested, there's a book by Pascal Boyer called Religion Explained. Paul Bloom also has a book called Descartes' Baby, and he kind of looks at the idea of dualism as well as supernatural ideas. Another book called In God We Trust by Scott Aitken. And then the two books, and then Born Believers by Jesse Barrett, and then Jesse Barrett did the Princess Alice study. He also has a book called The God Instinct. So you can find more about the very accessible books if you're interested. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. So now we have lots of time for questions. Over on the far wall there, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. I would like to know if you've worked with children in families where there is absolutely no conception of God at all. I have met some in France.
Great question. I have. So some of the kids that I work with in Oxford were from atheist homes and had absolutely no background. And they actually signed up to participate in the study because they were curious what their children would say, having known some of the research that we've done. And also because they know that they've never said a word about any kind of supernatural agents to their child. And so there's two instances. So one instance, he was a 5-year-old little boy, and he was doing a lot of these tests. And so I was saying, do you think God would know, what was inside the box? Do you think God would know the location of that card in the memory task? And he said, yes, yeah, of course God would know. And his mother's sitting there, what is this boy doing? And he was giving me more information. Well, God, because God can do this, God can do cartwheels in the sky, and giving me all these kind of extra information. She's sitting there absolutely perplexed. And then I also asked parents to give answers to these same things, just to see if there was any parallels with what the kids were saying and what parents were saying. And she was saying no to everything just because she didn't believe in these types of agents. And the little boy sitting there, perplexed, his mother's responsive, and going, Mother, why are you saying these things? The answer, of course, is yes. And she said afterwards, I think we're going to have to start talking about these ideas. I don't know where he's picking up these ideas. We certainly haven't talked about it. But it kind of shows in that instance that somewhere this little boy was either picking up ideas about, or it was an intuitive sense of what this being who's all-powerful is talking about. And there was another instance, a little boy, his family just moved to Oxford, they're from an atheist background, and he was 4 years old, kind of similar thing, he was saying all this extra information about God, and she's sitting there perplexed again too. I don't know where he's picked up this information. And I only heard about a year later from a friend that this little boy, after this experiment, kept asking about God and who this person was and all this stuff, and she wasn't prepared to answer any of it. And as it happened, the same kind of time period, a person had asked him to a mother and toddler group that happened to be based at a church. And just so happened, this little boy basically got to have all his answers, or his questions answered. And the family actually became Christians because this little boy was so insatiable, wanting to know all about God and all these things. So it's a very interesting story, and not something that I think happens normally, but I think these kids find these ideas so interesting no matter what background they're from, because it's interesting. And who knows where these concepts originated, but somehow they've picked up either from intuition or they've heard from maybe other kids at school about this kind of stuff.
Could I just ask, do you use the term God with them, and do you explain what you mean? And do you find, I mean, because presumably a kid brought up in an atheist home wouldn't necessarily know the term
Right,
God.
there's a cultural aspect to it. There's some kids that so in the beginning, you know, just because I'm going to be talking about God and a lot of other supernatural agents from the beginning, I do ask in the very beginning, do you know, I'm going to mention someone, do you know who God is at all? And if they say no, I kind of explain, well, God's someone that can do anything, he's all-powerful, he knows everything, he knows what you had for breakfast, and these kind of things. But that seems to be all it takes for them to understand, oh, this is basically a really all-powerful being. And that's all it takes for them to answer these questions.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Could you please comment on reproducibility of your experiments, in the sense that children, even adults too, respond to the questions differently in different circumstances. So this is one point, reproducibility of your experiments. And second thing is, it would be really interesting how children respond to these questions. For example, in Buddhist culture, there is no clear or undisputed conception of God. Okay, and thank you.
So reproducibility is a big thing in any kind of science. It's good to be able to have, you could say, you know, with a lot of authority, this is the way kids are. And what we've tried to do is do this with kids in a lot of different cultures, because that would speak to us that it's not only reproducible, but it's universal. So we did this in Israel, Albania, and Britain, and found no differences. And to your Buddhist question, Justin Barrett got a huge grant to look at kind of supernatural belief in China, in a lot of different areas. And so he's been doing a lot of these sorts of tasks, as well as a variety of others, to see how kids, especially growing up in a society where they do have supernatural agents, but maybe not these ideas about who God is. And there's no difference. And when I was in Albania, Albania is an interesting country because they had 50 years of communism and no kind of idea about supernatural agents, and there was some difference there as well. They were a little bit later on the theory of mind tasks, and that could be educational reasons, but once they acquired theory of mind, and even before, there was no difference between their responses with the other samples. So it seems to be, I mean, we're not prepared to say that it's a universal concept, but it's starting to show trends in all these different countries and a lot of these different cultural influences. It seems to make a whole lot of difference, yeah.
In your graph, you did mention mean, but not standard deviation. Was it not important?
Oh, it's important. I just, for people that may not know science, I didn't put a lot of statistics and that kind of thing, more pictorial things for people to understand. Yeah.
Okay, Adele, and then we'll go right to the back.
I do think it's cruel to tell children that there is a God. And I also...
Could you hold the microphone up to your lips?
Also, I do think generally I'm psychologically doing experiments with children in all sorts of psychological areas, but particularly there are fundamental mechanisms in the mind that we should not really be doing those sorts of experiments with children. I did remember when I was hearing when I was 4 that my grandmother had thrown the Bible against the wall and said there was no God when after her husband died in the First World War. Then follows a whole life of confusion, not from a religious home. All this stuff that you hear on the radio and what is this God? So I was in my 50s before I got into the neuroscience of mind enough to really understand these mechanisms. And so I think it's I don't think we should really be doing this with children. Yes.
Well, none of this research is actually saying any type of belief in God or saying that these gods exist.
But
Or even
it's enough
fairies.
to set it off.
Pardon me?
It's enough to set it off in a child's mind.
Sure, but I mean, kids naturally already think of these, so
Then we shouldn't do it.
But they already naturally think about it. They're talking about it on the playgroup, whether it's the Tooth Fairy to Santa Claus. I mean, there's another study called the Candy Witch, and so they actually told people that a Candy Witch exists in Halloween, and they got parents to actually participate in giving, like, leaving candy in certain places. So these kids actually believe in the Candy Witch. That might be some place where maybe they shouldn't have them believe in this weird agent. The kids already naturally do it, so it doesn't seem to us, if they already naturally do it, it's okay to talk about it. We're not, actually being proponents that these things actually exist or that they should believe in it. But we're just curious to see why in the world do they exist, and why in the world do children talk about it so much.
There was a question right at the back. I can't see who it is yet.
I really enjoyed the talk. To what extent do you think that these beliefs about the supernatural are intuitive and they come from birth, and to what extent do they come from kind of the idea that for the first 3 or 4 years in your life your parents are supernatural beings? If you have any questions, they've got answers. If you need food, they have a cupboard, they just pull it out of nowhere. And all of these things appear as if supernaturally. Do you think that these first 3 or 4 years of life where your parents are almost supernatural beings, do you think that has an influence over it rather than a kind of intuitive pathway of the mind that we're born with?
Good question. I don't know, maybe in an evolutionary sense we've evolved that way because you are completely reliant on your mom and dad when you're little, and if you didn't think that they were all powerful, you'd probably disregard what they have to say. And again, I mean, that could just be how you've been prepared or evolved to kind of think in those certain ways. And you're right, it could be, what we presented as cognitive mechanisms. So these are cognitive mechanisms for you to learn about the natural world. A byproduct of it is to think about supernatural agents. So a byproduct could be that we do kind of tend to apply superpower and supernatural type of ideas to not only your parents, but maybe other adults in your life. Justin Barrett would say that kids come into the world prepared to think that there's kind of these supernatural ideas, and kids up until about 4 or 5 when they develop theory of mind seem to apply supernatural ideas liberally to everybody and all beings. From what I've seen with my research, I'm not sure, to me it's still questionable whether kids do that. They do seem to liberally apply supernatural powers and that kind of thing to a lot of people. But at least as you've seen with those graphs, they do seem to be able to distinguish between them. So I'm trying to figure out how much do children actually understand these limitations, or are they prepared to think about adults and other beings literally that they've got supernatural qualities. But I don't think it's a bad thing that if kids do this. I think it's a good thing for they think their parents are, these wonderful beings that seem to know everything. I think that's a good thing for them.
It's quite good for the parents as well. Roger? This Roger.
You use the word intuitive. It's just occurring to me that God is an actor throughout all your experiments as well. I mean, God is acting and influencing the minds or the souls or whatever mechanism you think exists of every individual, or can do so. So my question would be, do you have any insight as to how early in life one could have a subjective experience of God?
Could you define more subjective experience?
Yeah, I mean, at what stage do you think a child could receive an inspiration from God and recognize it as some guidance about some question?
That's a good question. So that would probably go more in the spiritual domain of psychology, which is not in my. I basically looked at kind of more cognitive mechanism and how they develop these ideas, and not really more about their spirituality. But I would imagine, probably around 4 or 5, when they develop some kind of theory of mind and awareness of otherness, that they probably would have a better understanding of this kind of more subjective.
Just to back that up, would you think that might be somehow conflated with what you're calling intuition?
In what way?
Well, what do you mean by intuition in your experiments?
So I'm using intuition because I don't want to use the word innate. So it's intuitive. These things seem to come naturally to us, but I wouldn't say it's innate. It's not something that we're born with, because these ideas seem to develop throughout development naturally. Just like you're not born walking, you develop naturally how to walk. You're not born talking, but you develop naturally how to talk. So it's these same kind of ideas. You're not born with them, but you develop an understanding of them as your mind develops, as your body develops, as your awareness develops.
See, I haven't thought about the dictionary definitions of intuition, but the word looks like being taught within, doesn't it?
Which is a fair point. It's hard to talk about maybe to avoid kind of this innateness. So if there's a better word, I'm open to maybe what the.
Can you come forward here now? Samuel has a question.
I would like to go back to your first presentation slide. You talked about Richard Dawkins with regard to his view on morality, that religion, promotes that on children. It's like pressure on them. What he thinks about morality, like if religion is not going to give them children, then what he thinks about that. Can you just comment on that?
Well, I'm not sure exactly, but I'm sure, as many atheists would say, there's a lot of actually really fun experiments that are done with adults about how people perceive religious people or atheist people, and across the board it seems that people would trust a religious person over an atheist person, because there seems to be this assumption that, well, religious people are probably more moral than an atheist person. So I know he, as well as other atheists, are trying to work to correct that, to have people think that actually atheists are very humanistic, they like people, they're also very moral. So I think he would probably say that parents need to teach their children to still be moral individuals, regardless, it's not through the lens of religion, but at least through maybe treating compassion.
From there they are going to draw.
Pardon me?
From there they are going to draw that.
Where are they going to draw that morality from?
I'm not sure what he would say to that. Yeah.
Philosophy.
Sure. Okay, let's go to the very back now again.
Thank you. How important and how significant are intuitive beliefs? And does there come a time when you begin to introduce and encourage counter-intuitive beliefs? I'm thinking of child and indeed adult development.
So how significant?
Yeah, and important are
to our development?
intuitive beliefs.
Well, I suppose it depends on what you feel about or think about your spirituality or how you think about religion. Certainly Dawkins would say that these are infantile and things that we need to overcome, where someone who's maybe more open to religion would think, well, maybe we should listen more to our intuition and kind of how this forms our thinking. So it really depends maybe where you fall along the spectrum. I certainly think that these ideas are interesting because I think they still promote creativity. So thinking about things that are outside of our world, if you're thinking outside the box. And certainly a lot of very successful stories like Tolkien and Lewis, they play with these MCI type of ideas and this intuitive thinking. We find it fascinating. So I think there's a lot of creativity that comes from it. So I think ignoring that would basically ignore a lot of really important literature. Or things like science fiction. Science fiction also has a lot of these intuitions with a spin. But it allows us to have the platform to think about ethics, about law, about morality in a different way, a different platform to think about it. So I think they're really important. I think they're really significant.
Right at the very back, George, and then we'll come forward in one row.
There's a child.
No, there's George at the back.
Sorry.
I wanted to go back to the endorsed entities stuff that you presented, because I think I might have misunderstood it. But with the non-endorsed versus endorsed versus, sorry, what was the other one? Scientifically endorsed.
Yeah.
Did it not seem to show that kids' belief in certain things was dependent on the endorsement of these things, and thus is that not supportive of potentially the indoctrination hypothesis?
I mean, they didn't collect a whole bunch of other data to kind of see what was driving this, and I'm not sure if, I don't remember from the methods if it actually says how many of these kids were religious or not, because I think that would have a huge difference to see if they're endorsed from a religious family, then that says something from the difference from a child from a non-religious family, how much these are endorsed. So he was looking more at belief, and certainly I think how you've grown up has an impact about how much these are endorsed. Because in some families, they don't do the Tooth Fairy, they don't do Santa Claus, and those kinds, so it wouldn't be endorsed, but they see it in culture. Something that I would like to do is it's now being done in China and in certain places in Scandinavia where there's not a lot of kind of endorsement of these ideas, how much kids believe and endorse these characters when they have living in an environment where they're not really exposed to a lot of this. So it still has yet to be done, but I think you bring up a good point that if they're in a culture or a family that is endorsing these, then they're probably more likely to say that they believe it. I think one of their main points was kind of the language. They were looking at maybe the language that's being used. So none of us would say, I believe in mermaids, I believe in ghosts. But you would say, I believe in Santa Claus. And same with germs. Those are talked about very factual. Like, of course, they exist. We wouldn't say I believe in germs or I believe in oxygen. We talk about it and that they exist. So I think what they were looking at is how these agents or non-agents, like in germs and oxygen, are talked about. So I think that was the spin that they were taking. But it's a valid point.
There was a question just in front of George. Did you have a question?
You have answered my question a little bit. My question was whether you worked alongside anybody that was working in cultures that in reincarnation or past life regression or and that sort of area.
I haven't, but there's a colleague named Claire White who's she's working in California and I can't remember which, thank you. And she's looked at reincarnation. So she worked with people in India and another culture to look at kind of how these ideas play about. So she's done some research and she's just published an article on it. And I can look it up and give it to you if you're interested. But she works mainly with adults, but she does have some child development studies on it.
Okay, let's come down the front here. Dennis. Oh, who are you? Dennis. Well, let's have Dennis here because I'm trying to get around everybody.
Yeah, sorry, can we just come back for a moment to intuition? I know you've given it quite a good coverage, but I just want to carry on a little bit on that line. I'm glad you don't use the term innate. That's a good move, I think. I'm just wondering, in a sense, because it came in your conclusions as well, what we're talking about here is very rapid learning ability. You might even make another acronym. But you know, well, this is a question. I mean, in a sense, are we not talking about a natural ability to learn things very rapidly, including things like gravity, including things and so on? So, would you be prepared for that? That really, when you're using the word intuition, what we're referring to is that cognitive ability just to learn things really, really quickly.
I really like that.
Okay, rapid learning ability. Okay,
Yeah.
how about a new acronym? Easier than that. Okay.
Dennis likes acronyms for those that don't know him.
Thank you.
Okay, one last question. Okay, did you have a question at the back? Can you use the microphone, please? Yes.
I guess my question is just a methodological one, and that is how much the person who has some belief asking the questions might be endorsing certain things by non-verbal kind of gestures or facial expression or something.
Sure.
Whether you can blind this in some other way. Can't make expression.
And that's always the case with kids. I mean, and especially we know from psychology, I mean, certain gestures, certain facial expressions, certain manner, way of talking can get people to respond in a certain way. And you do have to be careful with kids because they're so willing to please you. And they really want to say the right thing. And especially when they don't know, they just kind of look at you like, what's the right answer? So you do have to be really careful with that kind of thing. And that was part of the reason why I wanted to put Sweck inside, because Sweck is someone, none of us has heard about him. You know, they shouldn't have, because it's a made-up word and it's a made-up being. So part of that was just seeing, so regardless of who that is, who they've probably heard about, with an agent that they haven't heard about, can they still conceptualize or reason about him the same way? Because really, Sweck, we're trying to be equivalent to what God would be. So if we use an agent that they don't know of, can they still think about these kinds of things? He was kind of our equivalent type of being. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I can see that. It's just that obviously personal belief might still be a non-verbal cue, but I mean,
Sure, yeah, of course it could be, but we try to
hard.
we counterbalance and certainly you're tired on certain days, and so we really try not to influence the kids in a way. Of course, that would mess up our results.
I think these are conversations to carry on over coffee, so let's say thank you to Emily.